Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday for our fourth Small Great Conversation. My name is Je榊, and I'm delighted that you all could be with us today. TEDxJacksonville's mission is to open minds with inspiring ideas, and as such, we could not pass on the opportunity to use our platform to engage in these conversations. Small Great Conversations are a series of programs that were built around virtual gatherings, around honest dialogue about the realities of racial injustice and what each of us can do to stop perpetuating it. We were really privileged in having an extremely great roster of previous speakers that we could tap to engage in for this conversation. And so with that, today's conversation is with our 2018 speaker, Dr. Je榊M, and it will be moderated by TEDxJacksonville team member Yvette Angelique. Yvette is a poet, a teaching artist, and proven change strategist. She runs Narratives for Change, an arts-based social practice providing writing workshops, facilitating story circles, and publishing poetry chapbooks, essays, book chapters, EPs, and articles. And I think she just released a book recently as well. In the fall of 2019 at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, Yvette's dreams came true when she was selected as an associate artist to work alongside U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. Compelling storytelling is a way Yvette draws attention to social conditions and empowers individuals and communities to lead change. And she also does that with our speakers as our speaker coach for TEDxJacksonville.
Welcome. So let me just do a little introduction. Dr. Je榊M is an art historian, a curator, merges administrative, curatorial, and academic practices into her cultural practice of supporting artists and community development. She is an advocate for racial inclusion, equity, access, and Dr. Hayes is the executive director for Three Walls, a Chicago-based organization that brings segregated communities, people, and experiences together through the art. Dr. Hayes earned a PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary, a Master in Arts History from Howard University, and a BA from Florida International University in Humanities. So you are all about people and art, which makes you and I definitely sisters of the spirit. So welcome, Dr. Hayes. And how we got to know each other was through the curation of the Augusta Savage Renaissance Woman exhibit in Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, at the Cummer Museum. And it was wonderful working alongside with you. I curated a literary event to support that work. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my time here in Jacksonville. So welcome, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you, Yvette. And thank you for sharing about the impact of the Augusta Savage show. I think oftentimes after an exhibition ends, as curators and the institutions that host them, I think we forget that it has a lasting impact. And so, yes, and that poetry event was really incredible. I'm so glad that I was able to come down and witness the end result of that work and the impact of Augusta Savage and you on the young people in Jacksonville.
Oh, thank you. It was great because I had young people curate new work that was in response to your curation of her work. So that was like, wow. So it was wonderful. So a lot has happened, Dr. Hayes. So why don't we enter our dialogue from the space of what has largely gone unsaid in terms of the environment and some of the nuanced actions that have been overlooked in some of the conversations. So for example, the SEDS being and the messaging being the pontification of words that says, Black lives really do matter. And of course, we know that, and institutions and businesses are all writing these messages and perked up their energy around this topic. However, you know, as I listen to this, and you and I have had this conversation as well as other Black folk, we listen to some of these messages and they feel like empty words sometimes and veneer, because they don't have a lot of substantial backing behind them in terms of action. So since our talk, or since your talk, I should say, it feels like ours because we work together, but because it was your talk, your TED Talk, what are some of the ways that you push beyond the veneer? Because I'm sure you face this.
Yes, and I like the term veneer because I think that's exactly what it is. And, you know, being a Black woman in leadership, particularly in the visual arts where there's so few Black folks in executive or senior leadership, it's been really important for me to acknowledge who I am, right? Like, I am not divorced. This Black body is not divorced from the title or the work. And that I experience the same level of racism and sexism that the other folks are experiencing. And so in my role, part of it is being able to speak to artists and creatives who share similar identities and speak directly to them. At the same time, kind of calling out the empty platitudes, right? The so-called empathy. And a lot of art museums are absolutely doing this and also experiencing a reckoning. But there's a lot of labor that goes into even the calling out, right? There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into that, to only get defense, right? To only get fragility in terms of you calling out these racist acts, which become very subtle, and then being gaslighted as if it didn't actually happen.
Right.
And so there's that work of speaking and trying to affirm the community that I serve and I'm part of, at the same time holding individuals within these institutions in leadership somewhat accountable. And that's one way to kind of get past that. Also to kind of pull your labor off the table.
Right. And the key word here is labor, because I think that folk in organizations do not understand. You know, they reach out to Black folk like you and I in crisis. Yes. Come tell me what to do. Can you look over my Black Lives Matter, you know, messaging? Give me your ideas. Can you come to the table? Can you meet with me? And you and I both have sat at many tables. You know, Black Lives Matter, civil rights. There's been several different levels of protests and revolution outward and inside organizations. So this is not new for us. But when it blows up in the media and then folks really want to pull on you, and then that's when it's like the bigger offense for me. It's like, wait a minute, you know, we've had these conversations many times. This is nothing new. So what do you say about like some of this piece? Because for me, it's about re-injuring. It's like raising up the trauma that we carry as Black folks, racial trauma that we've carried through our own lives, through the lives of our parents and our grandparents, all this legacy. And then people continue want to access our labor. Say a little bit more about ways that you've had to kind of deal with that.
Yeah, and it's labor. And so, yes, folks don't understand how much labor it is to navigate these spaces, especially in moments like we're experiencing now, right? We're experiencing a reckoning, a revolution, and resistance. and that there is this racial trauma. And so, I experience this all the time, as we acknowledge, but definitely of late, with a couple of projects actually in Miami, and working with a photographer, Je榊-reen M, on an exhibition for an institution in Miami, calling out their racism, their acts of racism, which again tend to be subtle. It's not only about like the Confederate flag, right? It is the ways in which folks presume how their role kind of in the work and questioning you. And so this was happening with this project, and we decided to pull the project after giving the institution an opportunity to address it. And it's not the lip service, it's actually action. And they didn't want to address it. So we pulled the project, which means also pulling our labor, and they wanted additional labor from us to help them get there. And this is where I definitely say, this isn't my work to do, right? This is your work as an institution. And if you say that you believe in this project, you believe in our abilities, and you represent your community, which includes Black folks, then you actually have to do the labor.
Right.
You can't continue to ask Black people to be your kind of racial doula in that sense.
Right. Oh, absolutely right. And I mean, I've had similar requests where I've just flat out told people, no, I'm not doing this. And if you're interested in having me participate in your conversations or on your panel, first of all, I'm going to pick and choose what I want to do because it is emotional labor for me. And in terms of my intellectual labor, you want my experience, my strategies, my ideas. Well, there's a fee for that. And so just this whole notion of, we not only want to tap into your talent, but we want, to do it in ways that are disrespectful. And, you and I have talked about this whole notion of there's a subtlety around an anti-Black sentiment that is really underlying all this, because it's really about, and when I say anti-Black, what I mean is the reality of the structural reality of inhumane treatment of Black people, okay? And that it's an attitude that devalues Blackness, and it is very subtle in ways in like our lives and the lives of our children. We shouldn't even begin to expect to have a level of access or equality to white children. Like, we should be lucky that we're here. And when it comes to different funders and so forth, there's a process, art funders and grants. Like, we have to kiss the ring to have our work and knowledge seen and acknowledged as being real artists. So there's a lot of subtle ways that we are engaged as Blacks and Black artists in particular that shows us an anti-Black sentiment.
Absolutely. And this is something that I've become that much more focused on. Because when we talk about racism more largely, yes, we are talking about racism in terms of really like white supremacy, right? And so other racial groups also experience it if you are not white or European descent. But what is becoming, I think, clearer and clearer is that, yes, anti-Blackness is this subtle thing, and it is something that everybody kind of perpetuates. And it's because they've internalized whiteness. And so you can be Latinx and be anti-Black, right? Like, that's a conversation that we're not truly willing to have more publicly. But as a Latinx individual or a Jewish individual or Asian individual, when you are called out for your anti-Blackness, it's like, well, no, but I have this identity, so I'm also marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to anti-Black, when we're talking about racism, we need to get to the nuance of what it means to be anti-Black. And the ways in which we all kind of internalize that, right? So like in my work as a leader of a nonprofit, my ideas and the way that I work are always questioned,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I'm Black, because I'm also a woman. And so there's this misogynoir mixed with that.
Mm-hmm.
And no one will actually acknowledge that, like, this is more than just racism. This is actually anti-Blackness. And that if I were a white woman, if I were a white man or a Black man, I wouldn't be questioned as much as I am now. I'm overly scrutinized. And this idea of, you brought up like kiss the ring, it is demoralizing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I have gotten to a place, particularly in my role as an executive director, when it comes to funders, I will explain what we do. What we do is very clear. I might have a second conversation with you about what we do, but I'm not going to have a third one, because that third one is demoralizing. And that tells me then that you actually have a bias, and it's probably an anti-Black bias.
Right.
And so we probably actually don't want to work with you.
Right.
So that's some of the labor, and making a decision, right? Like, how far are you willing to go to fight? But part of that fight is also knowing when to stop in terms of that person or that institution, and to kind of move and move in the way that we do. Yeah.
The issue you raise, I mean, that's such a perfect example, you know, about how many conversations. I was on another program a couple months ago, not even a couple months ago, actually, it was a couple of weeks ago. Time is crazy these days. And I was receiving Q&As. And oh, by the way, the Q&As feature is how you can ask us questions, and we'll be collecting them. I forgot to say that earlier. And if you're on Facebook, you can put them on your comments. So you can certainly ask us questions. We'll respond to them at the end. At one point, there was a series of African-American women, Black women, who were asking me questions around how do I, what I was hearing as, convince, you know, white people that I'm worthy, that I'm professional, or I deserve this opportunity. And they were getting into this line of question. I said, just stop. You do not need to prove that you are worthy to anybody. I said, you show up in all of your Black and brown brilliance. Do what you do. And then you tell them what you need from them for them to sit at your table. And I said, so there is an internal shift that I believe that also Black and brown people need to have within ourselves, to say, whoa, hold on. And I know that systemically, white folk hold the purse and the powers in these institutions. And in this day and space and time, it's now to step up and say, here's what I need from you to sit at my table. Because in these times of crises, as the pandemic has shown, you know, folk want to hear from poets, they want to hear from musicians, they want to hear from artists. They're looking for our brilliance, our talent, to come and be the thread of humanity in this space. And we know that that's a big place for artists. You know, we are the interpreters, we are the truth tellers, if you will, of culture. And yes, we add value, quality of life for every human being. we do not have to prove who we are to anyone. And so it's this habit, and it's because of this anti-Black sentiment that we all have been sniffing in the air. Mm-hmm. And we all have been taught this about who we are as Black folk, less than, not valued. And hey, you have the audacity to want what I want. You have the audacity, to ask for, to be seen, because, you're lucky to be here. You're lucky. I said, no, I'm not lucky. I'm skilled and talented.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up, yes, all of those are really important points. There is this sense that white institutions, white artists, white funders, mm-hmm. what have you, that they are doing you or me a favor, right? Mm-hmm. When the reality is, you actually can't do the thing that you want to do without us. And I think it's really important to understand that we do have so much power. Mm-hmm. And you spoke earlier in terms of wanting our ideas, wanting our brilliance. And yes, they want all of those things, but they don't actually want us in the flesh, right? They want the product, they want the productivity, which connects back to, we know this long lineage of slavery. Right. It's the Black body producing the thing that I want to capitalize off of, I want to sell. Right. And forget your humanity. We are now in a moment where Black artists, Black folks have to, and they are saying, actually, no, you actually don't get my brilliance if you don't want all of me. Right. And to want my brilliance is to actually want all of me.
Right. Right.
So, yes.
Yes. Snap, snap, snap. So let's amplify what we want, So what do we want for Black artists and art spaces? What do we want in order to have our activism engaged, as well as for other Black, Indigenous people of color? Let's amplify what we want.
I mean, we want equity. Mm-hmm. It's not so much a matter about equality for me. Mm-hmm. I want equity, which means that my needs are most likely more than, right? So pay me, mm-hmm. Fund me to that level where I am equitable, right? And get me closer to being whole, right? I think that for me, what I really want is for Black artists and creatives to fully realize that they have so much power.
Yes. Yeah.
They have so much power. Your brilliance, what you create, what you do, is just one aspect of that. Right. And it is okay to say no to that opportunity, because chances are that opportunity may not get you to where you think it's going to get you. It'll get that institution there, but will it get you there? And so owning your power enough to say, you know what, this probably isn't the right thing, I'm gonna direct it here.
Right.
And to build more together, I think we have absolutely, again, historically have built this foundation, particularly in the arts, and for a lot of arts institutions over the past 10 years, on what we do and what we contribute to the world. Mm-hmm. I think we need to pull that away from those spaces and actually amplify the spaces that have been created to welcome us, or create our own spaces. Mm-hmm. And in that, absolutely request equitable support and funding from both, right? It's not enough to kind of, in terms of being an executive director of a nonprofit, it's not enough to give me funding simply based on my budget, my operating budget. Right. I actually need more than that to scale up, to actually pay folks equitably, to dream. And so when we're thinking about supporting artists we need to get past that. Well, we're giving someone that amount of money, and you should get the same amount.
Right.
Like, you're around the same budget, and it's like, well, we're doing different things and we have different needs.
Right.
And Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks, our institutions have been underfunded.
Exactly.
So you can't even get us to equality because we're not being funded equitably.
Exactly.
And that's the case for artists as well, who are, doing residencies, being commissioned. So those are a couple of the things that I want.
Yeah, I mean, I can join you in on that, because the assumption is that if I fund you equally to white institutions, the assumption is that we're starting at a playing even, even playing field, which we are not. We are even not on that same line. We are staggered 10 steps behind. So we have to work our way up to zero in order to really move forward. And that's so on point. Well, you and I are definitely on the same place, because when I think about what I want Black artists to be paid, and I want them to be paid well. I don't want some stipend given to a Black artist that can't even pay their gas or material to deliver the work. And then folks saying, oh, I paid you. So for me, that is we just need to stop that behavior, period. And it's not about, oh, this is going to give you exposure. Take that out your tongue. Take that out of your tongue. Because when I think about my former life as a banker, no one asked me to come to work for free. And also, that what I was doing was giving me exposure. No. I deserve to be paid, and so forth. And I also want Black artists, particularly you mentioned residencies. I went to Sabine when she did the introduction. I had an experience at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in New Smyrna Beach. It was a wonderful experience with Jeorszár. And for the first time in a small circle of 8 people, I was not the only Black person. It was 2 Black women, actually. And my experience from attending residencies for over 20 years, I am usually the only Black person in a room of about 50 or 60 other artists. And I don't get that, so when I think about what I want at least 75% of those residencies that are paid residencies. I haven't been on a paid residency yet. I'm looking forward to that. But a paid residency where 75% of the artists selected are Black people, Black women. Because here's the thing, we already have all the data to support around the percentage of dollars that we work less or receive less than whites and men. We already have that data, 75 cents to the dollar, 68 cents to the dollar, so, whatever those numbers are, we know that. And we still have to live, and we still have to work, and just like everyone else. So these paid residencies, this space to create, is so critical to an artist's ability to really think, grow, and imagine something that's not even there yet. Mm-hmm. It's crucial to who we are in our role in society, as artists, as people who do the connection, who lead the connection, who tell the stories, who are the truth tellers. And so when I think about what I want, I say, oh no, we can't even begin to even look like we're having a for real conversation. I want my next residency to look like 75% brown and Black people in that room. For me, that's walking the talk, and that's saying, you're right, Black lives do matter, and we are really behind the game. So when I think about what I want, that's what I want. I want to see that change.
Yeah, that's important. And I'm there with you. It's one of the things that I have been working on at Three Walls. Coming into an organization that very much, followed the norm, the status quo in the art world, in that it was a predominantly white institution in a city that is racially diverse. And coming in and saying, hey, like, actually, we need to do the very thing that you said. Like, what we need to actually reflect our community. Right. And our community is over 60% people of color. Right. And that the board of directors needs to also reflect that. And thankfully, at that time, the board was game, because I'm still there almost 5 years later, and we've been doing that work. And so it does take that commitment. It's not the lip service. We want action. And it actually does not take a lot to make that happen, the 75% happen. Right. It is the folks who want to hold on to the old way of being. And look, real talk, that old way of being is being dismantled. It is disintegrating in front of our eyes. And so if institutions, foundations, and artists are not part of that building, y'all are going to get left behind, because it is moving. Right. Whether it's going to happen within your institution or not, we are moving in that direction, which is an exciting time for someone like me who's been doing this work for 20 years. Exactly. It's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting to just be on the edge of what's possible, what could really be possible. And to not make it, I was on a conference yesterday, and if I heard once, I heard 3 times about uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable. And I'm thinking, okay, who is this uncomfortable for? Here we go again, taking care of white folk and their ability to not hear. And I go, first of all, this is not an uncomfortable conversation. This is a necessary conversation. What this is a conversation that some folk are unskilled at having.
Yes.
All right. So Black folk have been having these kinds of conversations for years, are very skilled at having these conversations.
Yes.
And so it's not about discomfort, it's about a lack of competence and skill to be able to engage in a conversation about, when we say, what do we need to create a space that is equitable and provides access and opportunity for Black folk, for Black artists? What are the strategies and the things that we need to put in place? Yeah. So there are plenty of folk that can have that conversation. And so when we hear is that, well, I can't find any, it's like I'm walking out the room, because I don't know. I always say you can't find what you're not looking for. So that's real talk for me. So when you really think about, kind of where we are, and I love that you talked about what 3 Walls is doing. What's really next for you in your work? I mean, you are all over the place. I love me some Dr. Hayes.
Ooh, well, it's after really 3 years of curating major projects. Right now, I'm falling back on the curating and completing, finally, the publication for the Afrocobra exhibitions, which will be ready for purchase or printed November. So it'll be available in November. And that is a great source of joy, even as it was rife, the process was rife with racism. And centering, because what you just talked about, Yvette, is white folks centering themselves even in these uncomfortable conversations, right? And so it was a project that was absolutely centering whiteness and white readers for a project that centered Black folk. And so calling out these acts and going through that process to get to a place where the publication will move into the world with love and care. So I'm excited about that. I am working on a podcast, I've found that it's important to have these kinds of conversations, and social media is great, but it's limiting. And so coupling the podcast with more writing, and writing about the things that are really important to me. I've been, not to say that the writing I've done over the past few years haven't been important, but they've been for other people.
Right.
And so creating a platform where there's this critical discourse happening. And just kind of, so, I mean, that's a lot, but it's a different kind of, it's a different way of doing the work that I do as a curator, where I'm not on these deadlines, and, but still being able to uplift the artists that I support, and want to continue to support, like giving them a different kind of space that is not inside a museum. I'm not, quite frankly, I've curated my last museum show. I don't think the institution as it stands is one that can actually hold the work that I want to do.
Right.
And so
they're not good enough for you in terms of your imagination and what's possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it is. It's just, yeah, it's thank you. That's a very beautiful way of putting it. But yes, that's it. And so beginning to also think about, well, what does curating mean to me when I'm really curating for a very specific audience, which is Black folks, and where are those spaces that they can access the work, kind of building off of Augusta Savage, building off of Afrocobra, in that, you know, they were born kind of out of this moment of mural making in Chicago, in Black communities. So it's really important for Black folks to see themselves in their own spaces. And so thinking about that as a curator, white-led institutions, art museums are not that space.
Right.
No matter how many Black curators they may have on staff, or Black educators. If the leadership is not diverse, if they have no Black person who can make institutional decisions, it is not a space that my work can actually live in.
Right. I mean, I think that's so clear. We got a few questions that have started to pop up, so let me share one with you. One says, can Dr. Hayes share an example of organizations or institutions gaslight for others to understand? So that whole terminology around gaslighted. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll share in terms of my experience with the Afrocobra publication, working with this institution in Miami, and having these moments of me saying, well, this is a collective who centered Blackness and the diaspora, and that this publication needs to reflect that. The exhibitions reflected that. And so it cannot be linear, it cannot be Western in its format and how we're thinking about it. So saying that from the very beginning, to then throughout the process, folks ignoring that and going a Western route, me saying again, yo, this actually is not what we talked about. I've already expressed X, Y, and Z. I need to see that. And having the leadership ignore that when I say this process is actually racist. This process is a form of colonialism in the excitement of producing the first book on Afrocobra. Like, that is where your focus is. You're actually not focused on the content and getting it right for the project and these artists. This is racist. And having the leadership address certain things, but not the racism, as if it doesn't exist. And me having to come back and say, this is a problem. And I need everyone to acknowledge their role in upholding white supremacy. And folks finally getting it because, one, nobody wants to be called a racist and certainly don't want to be called a white supremacist. That's not what was being said. But the fact that the racism that I had addressed was ignored. Like, oh, well, that actually isn't it. And then also the leadership saying, well, I'm actually anti-racist. And it's because I have this particular identity. And it's like, but you're not actually addressing the racism. Mm-hmm. And I'm not calling you racist. It is the acts. So that moment of you calling out this moment of racism, mm-hmm. and them just kind of ignoring it, like glossing over it because they want to get the job done, right?
Right.
So that would be an example. Or like acknowledging, calling out that like the History Miami Museum, this is the institution that we pulled the project from. Mm-hmm. In their Black Lives Matter statement on social media, in response to George Floyd, they name George Floyd, but they don't say anything about Black lives. They don't even use the word Black.
Right.
So that's an all lives mattering moment.
Right.
And us saying, hey, but you didn't even call out, like, here's this racism. How are you speaking to this moment? Well, we did this statement. Mm-hmm. And me saying, but you didn't even mention Black people.
Right.
Like, you didn't even mention the word. Right. And not even responding to that in that moment until we decide to put, like, in the process of pulling the show, they address it and be like, well, defending it and then apologizing afterwards.
Right.
So those are a couple of examples.
And actually that covers about two questions.
Oh.
One person had a question about white people address each other's white as default status. And so I guess, when I think about the white as a default status, that's what it is in our culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in addressing how not to do that is, instead of just assuming, mm-hmm. how about just ask the question, how are you imagining this exhibit? Or what ideas do you have about how this can unfold? Yeah. Given the audience that we're working with, what are some of the ways that we can uplift So part of it is, it's not going in like we know, here's the agenda, here is, and the thing about linear is so right on. There is nothing I think about my Black culture and experience is ever linear. And so, and if you don't get that, yep. It's because folk will say, well, I'll sit in a meeting where white folks say, oh, I feel like I'm all over the place. I'm going, oh, I'm following you because my mind doesn't work in 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. It looks like a mind map. And I'm actually understanding and following. So it's not just a diversity of thought. Yeah, that could be true. And in our culture, it's just natural, normal, in terms of how we interact and play. So here's another question. Dr. Hayes, you talked about anti-Black funders. Do you have a written statement or a standard in your fundraising policy at 3 walls? Do you think that that's an important for nonprofits to have? Okay, so here we go again, a written statement or standard in policy. So I don't know. I have a reaction to that question. So it's for me. I mean, policies and laws are very important. What are you doing to drive the culture? I don't care what you write on that daggone piece of paper. How are you behaving and acting in that space? But I'm going to turn that over to you about, standard fundraising policy.
So we don't have a policy around fundraising. Mm-hmm. It is, so what I'll say in terms of the work at Three Walls, it is still new in terms of the fact that our shift has taken place over the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that has been really a seismic shift in who the organization is, who the organization is serving, and who is on staff or on the team. And so when it comes to the fundraising actually has not been so much an issue in Chicago, because the foundations here have committed to racial equity as part of their fundraising lens. And so we've been getting support. We have not lost support in terms of Chicago foundations. It has been like national foundations. And one in particular who's had a relationship with the organization for a long time, but it was that shift in leadership. It's the shift in the work that we're doing. And when I think about policies, you know, I think it can be a little bit tricky, because to Yvette's point, like, we can write it, but how are we living it, right? How are you living it? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm looking for in terms of funders and donors, even individual donors. We have a set of values, and that is how we move in the world through the organization. And so if you aren't actually reflecting and practicing the values that we have stated, then we're probably not going to be a good fit, because what I'm not willing to do is to bend over backwards to make a funder happy, when the work that we're doing isn't actually for you. Mm-hmm. It is for our community. Mm-hmm. And so, no, we don't actually have a policy. It's kind of unspoken at this point in terms of how far we'll go with a funder in that early conversation. And this is something that's really developed, I will say, over the past year. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions, and they have to do really about the moment. And we have about 5 minutes, so I want to kind of squeeze in one of them. And it says that how are artists and cultural workers and arts organizations, so these three entities, able to play a unique role in feeding this moment of reckoning? You know, what is an example of reparations in and through the arts? I mean, I think we've talked about like what we want. You know, that's beyond the 40 acres and the mule. But, you know, for me, you know, when you think about what are the reparations that could happen through the arts? I mean, for me, when I talked about, hey, 75% of your grants, your arts residency, your funding, you solely focus on Black artists, period. Mm-hmm. And just don't make anything, well, this is not fair, this is not right. We hear those other voices in the community yelling those voices. Things haven't been fair or equal ever. So if you're going to take the next 5 years and just focus on, I'm going to really focus on deeply in the Black community, where the majority of what we do, 75 to 100% of our funding is going to go there, that's an intense focus. So what's your thought?
Yeah, well, you know, thank you. That's a great question. All the questions have been really great. And this one is really interesting because the way that I think about the work at Three Walls is in terms of reparations. Mm-hmm. And it is about funding. It is about opportunity. It is about how much space do you hold mm-hmm. for Black artists in your organization or Black people. Mm-hmm. And the funding that we received last year to begin to address these inequities, particularly in Chicago, really is that next step in reparations. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be able to give Black and brown artists a huge chunk of money to do what they do?
Right.
And we're not talking about like $1,000 or even $5,000. What does it mean to be able to give these artists really over 2 years, $64,000?
Right.
And it's just for your research and it's for you to develop a project.
Right.
Like that is the step, that is how we need to move forward in terms of reparations with arts organizations. I think with artists, I think white artists need to say, look, I can't participate in this group show unless you hit these benchmarks. And unfortunately, we are still at the place where it has to be check the box until it becomes the standard. But white artists who are in these spaces, who have privilege because of your whiteness, you can be helping to advocate for the very thing that we're talking about.
Oh man, this is great. So we in 2 minutes, I want to end on this note, okay? In 1 minute, can you think of maybe what kernels of hope you see?
I see a lot of hope. I mean, I see that what's most hopeful is that Black artists are tapping into their power and organizing and not solely just putting out statements. They're adding demands and they are pulling their labor and they are not letting up. That is very exciting to me because at the end of the day, the institutions in which they are working in, whether they're a professor or they're on staff as an educator or showing, they will have to listen because it is not just a small group of folk. This is happening nationally.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing to see. So I'm going to have to get us at a closure piece because I think that's such a powerful message is around how we stick together to pull what belongs to us. So Dr. Je榊Hayes, thank you for your time. Thank you, TEDxJacksonville. Thank you, Sabine, our executive director, for leading us in this space. I really want to thank the audience as well. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions, but you know, you can reach Je榊on Facebook or Instagram. She's an Instagram girl. You can reach me on Facebook. And so we're always open to questions, and of course, leave them on our TEDx channel as well. So on that, I want to say have a great afternoon and thank you for being a part of our small conversation, but important conversation about racism. Thank you.